Welcome to Bamfordrose and its forum chat. This week it's about cranking the engine to get oil pressure so that when you start for the first time after a long period of being laid up, then oil pressure has developed and oil is circulated around the main gallery, crank journals, and pushed it up to the head and helped out with feeding cam journals and the lifter buckets. So it's in the manual, and some people know about this, some people don't. As each few years go by and there's a wave of new owners, then it becomes new news, when previously news like this I thought everybody knew. So this feature is really handy. We use it a lot in the workshop because we change oil and filter, and before we restart we crank for oil pressure, and then when we've been able to crank without the engine firing for oil pressure, obviously you can let it fire. So the cars that have this enabled are DB9, V8 Vantage, and it's all the way up to any Ford ECU car. So this covers 6-speed Vanquish but doesn't cover 8-speed Vanquish. Obviously it doesn't cover DB11 and new V8 Vantage, and it covers V12 Vantage 6-speed manual, doesn't cover V12 Vantage S, the Bosch engine management system, and it doesn't cover DB7 or Vanquish. For DB7 or Vanquish, you can achieve the same thing, just old school methods. If you wanted to go to town, you could disconnect the fuel pump driver modules or the relays that feed the fuel pump driver modules, and then crank. If you didn't want to do that, quick, easy, dirty, cheap way of doing it is to just crank for a couple of seconds, and as it fires, switch off, and then crank for a couple of seconds, as it fires, switch off, and do that a few times. You'd have generated some flow, and then fifth time of doing that you can crank for real, and you've helped out by doing a few cranks and initial fires just to get the thing pressurized up. So on all the cars that have got this mode featured then, and especially if you've been stood for a long period of time, what you're trying to do is crank without the engine firing so that the oil pressure light extinguishes on the dashboard, and at that point it's safe to fire. So across all of those cars that has this feature enabled, we've got automatic, manual or sport shift transmissions, and we've got conventional key start and glass center key. I'll go through how you would vary the procedure for each one of those derivatives, but essentially the way you're going to do this follows the same principle, and we do it by only ever turning the ignition on once, doing the crank for pressure, and then allow the engine to fire without having to cycle the ignition. I read lots on forums where people say, oh well, this cranking for pressure sometimes doesn't work. You put your foot fully on the throttle and you put the ignition on, and sometimes the engine starts. It's all because people are doing this incorrectly, and this is a fault of the owner's manual because it doesn't properly tell you how to do this procedure. So what we want to do is crank for, let's say, 5 seconds with then a 2-second rest, just to give the starter motor a bit of an easier life, and then another burst of 5 seconds, a couple of second rest, another burst of 5 seconds, a couple of second rest. And as I say, in doing that whole process, we're not going to turn the ignition off at all. Probably after the fourth time of doing that process, you're going to notice when you're cranking the oil pressure light extinguishes, and then you can let the engine fire. So let's have the procedure for key start cars, and this is going to be manual V8 Vantage. You're going to come to the car and turn the ignition on the key in the barrel fully. You're then going to put your foot fully on the throttle, and you'll hear the throttle body motor operate. Then you're going to put your foot on the clutch just to check that you get the crank enable light flash on the dashboard, but you're not going to actually press the button. You're just going to know it's ready to start, the ignition is on, and you've got full throttle. Then you're going to keep your foot fully on the throttle pedal, so you've got full throttle. You're then going to press the center start button, but you haven't yet pressed the clutch. So this is now, you're going to use the clutch as the switch to enable cranking, because you've already got cranking enable, and as soon as you go down and press the clutch, it's going to turn over. But it's not going to start because you've got your foot fully on the throttle pedal. After you've done your burst of 5 seconds, come off the clutch pedal. Leave your finger holding the start button and don't turn the ignition off. Wait a few seconds for the starter motor to cool down, and then press the clutch and give it another burst of 5 or so seconds. Keep doing that process until the oil light extinguishes, and then you can, as you're cranking, just lift your foot off the throttle. You've got your foot on the clutch, and it's going to fire up, and it's going to fire up nice and smooth without any jolt or anything like that. So that's how you do that process in one go without ever having to cycle the ignition. Now, people are getting into trouble and they've got their foot fully on the throttle and the car is firing up, because what they're doing is introducing the throttle pedal fully open at the wrong time. So if you were to put your foot on the throttle fully before you cycled the ignition, the system isn't going to be able to go through its icebreaker check, isn't going to be able to go through it opening the throttle blade just to get reference angles, because you've turned the ignition on whilst you've got full throttle. So in that case, if you press full throttle, turn the ignition on, and then crank, it's going to fire up. And that process of putting full throttle on before you've turned the ignition on is the reason why you've introduced that hiccup. And this goes back to the procedure I've just outlined as a way of avoiding that, because you only ever turn the ignition on once, crank for pressure, and then just pull your foot off the throttle pedal and allow it to fire. So DB9 manual is auto is exactly the same. It's just we're going to use the brake pedal as the switch. So ignition on, foot on the brake, you're going to see that you've got crank enable, it's there anyway on DB9 at key on. You're then going to take your foot off the brake, you're then going to put full throttle, you're then going to press the center start button and then use the brake pedal, as in this case the clutch pedal, as the switch to crank without firing to run through the process of getting oil pressure. So now we come on to V8 Sport Shift, and that is essentially the same conventional key 4.3 Sport Shift as the DB9. It's only going to differ if you've got the glass key. So the process of a push-through start on the glass key is a bit tricky anyway. So to crank for pressure with glass key, what I'm about to run through now is the easiest process. So let's just say this is Vantage S, for instance. We're going to get in the car and push the ignition glass key to position 2. So this is systems on, but you haven't gone for a crank. Okay. You're then going to press the brake pedal and paddle into neutral. With the foot remaining on the brake pedal, you're going to see that the crank enable red lights on the centre key have lit up. You're then going to press full accelerator pedal. You're going to push the key all the way through as if it was going to crank, but it won't because you've not got your foot on the brake pedal. And now you're going to use that brake pedal as the switch to control cranking. So you can press the brake pedal, do your 5-second crank, come off the brake pedal, but keep your finger pushed through on the centre glass key centre console, and keep your foot fully on the accelerator pedal. Wait a couple of seconds, go back on the brake pedal. Crank for a few seconds, run through the procedure so your oil pressure warning light goes off, and then when you see it does go off, you can keep your left foot on the brake and you can ease off on the throttle pedal, or take it, snap it to fully off, and then it will fire smoothly. So again, on sport shift cars, on centre console, glass key start, this gets round the problem of putting the accelerator pedal fully to open before you've turned the ignition on, and actually the engine cranks when you're at wide open throttle. You're not going to have that problem if you follow this procedure. If we are manual for a glass key start, it's exactly the same as if the glass key was the conventional key. So you're going to get in the car, push the glass key to position 2, systems are on, but you've not pushed through to fully start. You're then going to open the accelerator pedal, you hear the throttle body open up, push it fully open. You're then going to press the clutch, you'll see the glass key crank enable lights come on, but you're not going to crank it yet. You're going to come off the clutch, push the glass key fully in so that it's going to crank, but then use the clutch as the switch to crank the engine. Run your procedure, crank it a few times, oil light goes off, and then when it does, come off the throttle pedal and it will fire up. So if you follow that process using either clutch or brake pedal as the switch, always keeping your finger on the start button, whether it was the conventional key and you're actually pressing the start button, or whether you're pressing the glass key, and use, as I say, the brake or clutch pedal as the switches, then you'll never get yourself into the hiccup of cycling the ignition, confusing it by opening the throttle before you turn the ignition on and it firing up when you want it to do this procedure of cranking without firing to build up oil pressure. Hope that's clear and that's helped you out. And as always, if you could like, subscribe and put your comments below, that really helps us out.